The Chinese are generally fairly consistent in behavior, although the target audience for developing a market can literally vary from city to city. Chinese are sensitive to price, conservative in spending, and they like to save their money. An American trader does not want their product to be perceived of as a luxury beyond which the average Chinese can afford. However, the growing affluent class in China sees luxuries as something to be acquired. Brand names are important to the wealthier Chinese consumer, but the affluent class is still not the majority of Chinese. The issue is one of perception, not necessarily one of fact. You must be able to convince your target audience, not yourself, that even though the product is imported, it should not be considered an inaccessible luxury. Transportation remains difficult, but is ever evolving and improving. What is difficult to transport today may not be difficult to transport a day from now. However, it is still a concern and should be reckoned with in doing trade with China. Most American brands are manufactured locally. Americans must compete with the local markets, North and Southeast Asia, as well as Europeans and Russians. China's language and customs are vastly different from our own, although the growing cosmopolitan nature of today's international China mitigates against this. Marketing, however, must not only be tailored to the interests of the Chinese consumer, but must be tailored to the interests of the larger metropolises and the variation in form and complexity of the Chinese in these cities. In considering second-tier trade, the market will be affected by how well a product can be made to appeal to one city, while it may not be a relevant marketing strategy for the neighboring city. Knowing one's market is critical and specific to a successful venture. Age and hierarchical position are important. I knew of a man who was the lead negotiator for a cell phone company that has long ties with China. The company had wisely chosen this individual to do business for them and negotiate the tricky process of contracts with China. While not Chinese, the man was Asian and understood the delicate nuances of communication with the Chinese. Every once in a while, this man would ask his company to authorize a new title for him, even though it did not mean financial remuneration for him. He needed the titles to carry like banners when negotiating with his Chinese partners. Personal relationships cannot be overemphasized. Without personal relationships cultivated over a long period of time, there will be no successful trade in the Chinese market. The notion of the group is another social consideration in dealing with a Chinese partner. The boss has more than an economic role to play in the life of his employees. He represents benevolence and concern for his employees. Some might say he is a second father. Although you may have a superior position vis-a-vis this boss, you must never usurp his position vis-a-vis the man's employees. He must always be regarded with respect. You have no place between he and his workforce. The notion of individual competition in entrepreneurship does not resonate with Chinese. This does not mean that the greater endeavor of one worker over the other is not appreciated, but it is regarded in a more subtle context than we might regard a better employee. Face is extremely important. All dealings must be kept respectful, not only in all negotiations, but with regard to the Chinese partners at all times. There is no chewing out of the Chinese partner in public. Unhappiness with a partner, even in private, must be kept to a certain level of decorum. That is, if you wish to trade in China. There are no exceptions. If you find the constraint difficult, China may not be the place for you to trade. Before attempting to build an export market, the target market must be thoroughly researched. The market for Shanghai may be absolutely irrelevant to the market in Beijing. The complexity is exponential when attempting trade with second-tier cities and regions. Knowing the target audience and its culture can be very beneficial. Knowing, for instance, that the Lunar New Year requires Chinese to present gifts to one another means that gifts styled for that occasion have a great chance of selling. It is one of the most financially successful times in the marketing year. On the subject of gift giving to individuals, it too can be a highly complex act, with the gift you give needing to be roughly equivalent to the gift you receive. For if you give a gift out of alignment with this expectation, the receiver will have a feeling of deficiency in his or her own sense of what they gave. It is possible to cause a loss of face in this department. Your Chinese partner will be quite instrumental in guiding you here, but in the arena of commercial trade, the various celebrations may be a time for additional profits. Know your competition. Australia, for instance, competes effectively against the United States in the beef trade. Asian vegetables are up against your own. The dairy products market has long been held by New Zealand. In 2003, the Russians gained a 37% share in the Chinese market, up from 25% the year before. In 2003, we gained a 7% rise in exports to the Chinese market, and in 2005, we had an 11% gain, tied to the lift in punishing tariff rates that had previously existed in trade with China. However, due to the economic hardships of recent years and the intensive competition by other near partners in trade, the Chinese commercial market can be volatile. However, while some American traders may experience downturns, others may rise. This is why a frequent presence in China is required of the American trading partner, not only because of domestic and practical issues that may arise, but because of the competitive environment from countries outside of China, but also from the Chinese themselves. It is no different from your own domestic factory. You are very likely present at your factory every day. China is no different in this regard. There is a growing recognition that there is a second tier of potential trade markets with China outside of the traditional entrepôts. Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Old Canton, and Xianggang, Old Hong Kong, have been defined as the traditional markets when Americans think of trade with China. However, only 3% of the Chinese population live in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong, while the rest of the population live outside these cities. Some have gone so far as to say the trade is easier in South China, where unofficial channels help mitigate against trade barriers that may occur elsewhere in the larger traditional markets in China. The immense wealth and the immense freedoms growing throughout China have had not a trickle-down, but a flood-down effect on cities such as Qingdao, Dalian, Xiamen, and the rising superstar Shenzhen, just up country from Hong Kong. When my husband and I first visited China, we took a bus from Hong Kong as far as we could go to a little merchant cluster near the border. On our second visit, we were allowed into Shenzhen, Old Guangdong, inside of the People's Republic, which was then a sleepy, albeit crowded nook filled with young people trying to wrest our American dollars from us. Today, Shenzhen is the starlet, a sophisticated, vast city with Chinese from the hinterlands daily flocking and swelling her numbers to fill the rapidly rising manufacturing sector. Shenzhen's growth is an explosion in slow motion, but from day to day, week to week, the explosion is of exponential speed, closing in on the speed of light. Shenzhen is but one of the many extraordinary glittering cities arising from afar, well outside the traditional centers of trade and commercial activity in China. Other cities, which are satellites to the main cities of Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong, are growing rapidly. It is becoming increasingly apparent that the old economic zones, free trade arenas that followed a loosening of communist control and ideology, are being bypassed for rapid transformation and independence of the second-tier universe of the Chinese economy. Even as the cities in the south are being forsaken in their Cantonese and Fukienese expression in the sleepy village of South China, Old Canton now being Guangzhou, Jixiang, Old Zhejiang. And just as the Japanese adopted an ease of language with kanji, so too the Chinese government is rapidly adopting an easing of restrictions on access to the lesser economies of the second-tier cities. There is no European Bund where the factors were held at bay, kept a distance from the Chinese interior. It can only mean that the government is comfortable with itself and with freedom necessary to reach the pinnacle of the world's economies. The Chinese, for their part, see our own country as comprising more than an east and a west coast, as Premier Zhu Rongji stated in April 1999 when in Colorado. The Chinese so distinguish the American market, and we ought to consider the second-tier trade in China with the same eye for specific interests and specific markets. A good businessman respects all of the pieces that comprise the whole of the puzzle. Today, China sees far beyond New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. She sees Colorado and Denver, and even small towns like Erie, as places for her consideration. The Chinese and the Americans look through the same telescope from different ends, but they see the same potentiality in each other. The second tier is the third wave of the economic boom, behind the initial opening of the door to China under Nixon and the subsequent widening of the door, where businesses were focused on the major cities. Lessons learned in the second wave of the opening of the Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Hong Kong markets can be applied to the second-tier markets. Chinese society is undergoing a rapid transformation. At present, there are principal degrees of separation in the Chinese population. Those born between 1946 and 1964, who lived through both a horrific and a revolutionary period of change. There are those born between 1965 and 1976, who came of age in a period of rapid modernization. After 1976, there is a generation separation. just as there is in the United States with Generation X and Generation Y. The Chinese refer to those born in the 1980s as Ba Ling Ho, and those born in the 1990s as Jiao Ling Ho. The interests of the different generations should have a central place in a sophisticated marketing portfolio. Your Chinese partner will be very important in helping you to understand the differences and meet the needs of the generational distinctions, as well as the differences of the first and second tier markets and their subdivisions. The freedoms fought for during the Tiananmen Square period of change have matured into the freedom of the growing market economy and affluence of China in the 21st century. As the names of cities have undergone change, Chinese trade and markets change daily. Just as in the digital world, there are constants and differences. There is the constancy that we need a computer. There is the realization that the computer and the software must be changed fairly often. There is the understanding that trade with China ought to be considered an absolute, but the way one perceives of trade with China constantly needs updating. Last year, the difficulty of moving product from city to country and vice versa may have been impossible, but today, a rapidly revolutionizing train system eliminates the problem. Yesterday, the Chinese market was conservative and cost-conscious. Today, growing affluence has changed the purchasing character of the Chinese, especially among the young. For those with faith and trust, those who have stood with China in good and bad as Colorado has, those who have taken the time to cultivate friendship and to understand the Chinese partner, are those who can look forward not only to the next year in a positive market relationship, but on to the end of the century. Loyalty and respect will always remain the steadfast keys to trade with China. Having learned and earned those two basic keys to success, American traders, with their innovative heritage and their willingness to produce a tailor-made product, can look forward to succeeding in the 21st century's new China trade.